What's up, guys? Welcome to Hope City. My name is Justin. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm so pumped that you're here with us today. If you're a guest with us at Hope City today, I know you could be a lot of different places, and we're just honored that you would spend part of your Sunday morning with us. If we can answer any questions for you or give you any more information about the church, please head back to Guest Central right after the service, and one of our volunteers will be happy to serve you. Well, I'm bummed that I'm not with you today as we wrap up our summer road trip series. We've been talking over the last few weeks about this idea that God invites us into a journey with Him. That His point isn't just our destination for all of eternity. He longs to transform our hearts along the way. He longs to make us different. He longs to make us more into the people, the men and women that He has in mind for us to be. And so while I'm not with you today, I'm super excited to introduce you to a good friend of mine. His name is Steve Wallen. And Steve is the pastor of Genesis Church, Carmel Campus. Yes, Genesis Church, right across the roundabout from our church. But more than just being the pastor of Genesis, Steve has had a really influential role and a really special role in my life spiritually. Many of you guys know that 13 years ago, my marriage and my ministry imploded, and we actually were a part of Genesis Church at that time. My wife and I helped start the church in Noblesville, and Steve was on our elder board. And over the course of the next few years, as my wife and I found healing, Steve and my relationship began to reconcile as well. And he and the elders of Genesis were super instrumental in my return to ministry. And so I think it's safe to say that I would not be the pastor that I am today, and Hope City would not be the church it is today without Steve and his wife Benita, the elders of Genesis, the leadership of Genesis, Paul Mumal, the pastor of Genesis. They have been huge supporters of Hope City and huge supporters of Trish and I. And so I'm indebted to Steve, not just for being here today, but for the role that he has played in my life spiritually and my role as a pastor in this church. And so would you do me a huge favor and give a huge Hope City welcome to my friend, Steve Wallen.
I did not get to see that before just now, and so I'm a little verklempt, so if you'll forgive me, that was very nice of Justin to say that. Justin and I have been friends for 15 years, and it is a privilege to be here with you at Hope City today. Justin's been on my case for about 8 months to come and talk to you, and I said no a couple of times, and then finally in the last few weeks, he said, hey, could you come over and speak? And I said, well, yeah, what do you want me to talk about? And he said, well, we're finishing up this series called Summer Road Trip. And I said, I just got back from the road trip of a lifetime. And I told him a little bit about this trip that I just returned to from Africa with World Vision, where I ran a 56-mile ultramarathon and then went to Ethiopia to see World Vision's work in the field in action. And Justin said, dude, that is the ultimate summer road trip. Would you come talk to our church about that? And so I said, yeah, I'd love to. So we're going to do that. And if you have your Bibles, you might open them to Matthew chapter 25. We're going to get there eventually, I promise. But for a while, this is going to probably feel like somebody you don't know showing them your vacation slides. So I apologize for that in advance. And thanks for your patience as we go through it. I want to tell you a little bit first about my fitness journey. My journey to fitness started when I was 12 years old. I was in 6th grade in PE class. On the basketball court, and when you play pickup basketball in gym class, guys, you play what? Shirts versus skins, right? And I was on the skins team, and I'd always been an athlete, I guess you could call it that. I played all the sports, no specializing back in those days. You played everything. And I took off my shirt on the basketball court, and my friend David turned to me and goes, Wallen, you're fat. And that stuck with me. I don't think he meant anything by it, but it kind of stuck with me. And so when I went to high school, I didn't play any more sports. I went to a huge high school, and you kind of had to be D1 bound to play a sport, so I didn't play. And then I went to college, and I put on the freshman 15. And after my freshman year of college, I weighed 209 pounds, which isn't a whole lot. But for this frame, it looked bad. And so I started to run a little bit, and I got a full-time job in college with some guys that were runners, and they did the mini marathon every year. And so my boss, said, Steve, why don't you come run the mini with us? And so that was in 1995. I ran the mini marathon for the first time, and it was fun, and I loved it. And so I ran the next year, and I ran the next year. And then in 1998, I decided to run my first full marathon, 26.2 miles. And I ran it, and I finished, and I said, I will never do that again. That was horrible. And it did take me 11 years before I went back and ran another marathon. But life happens, as you know. I got married, or I was married. I had kids, and I put on sympathy weight along with my wife when she was pregnant. I remember asking my wife's OBGYN, I said, yeah, how much weight is the husband supposed to gain during pregnancy? Because I think I've gained more than she has. And so I started running again, and I ran a couple marathons, and I got faster, and I got a little better. And then last year, in 2017, we invited Team World Vision, to our church, Genesis Church, to come invite our church into running a marathon to raise money for clean water projects. And so they did that last year, and we had about 25 people from Genesis Church that ran the Indianapolis Monumental Marathon last fall, we raised about $12,000 for clean water projects. I raised about $3,000 of that. Being the pastor, you have a little more opportunity to have influence in your church, and so I did a pretty good job of raising money. And so last fall, World Vision called me while I was still training, by the way, for the 26.2 mile marathon, and said, Steve, we have an opportunity I want to talk to you about. Would you like to come to Africa with us and run the Comrades Marathon and go to Ethiopia or go to some other country in Eastern Africa, we didn't know Ethiopia at the time, and see World Vision's programs in action? And so I said, just like you would if somebody said, would you want to come run a 56-mile race? I said, yeah, absolutely, right? That's what you'd do. See, I love running. I'm a student of running. I've never been the fastest runner, but I know a little bit about running. I'm a student of the history, and I knew a little bit about the Comrades Marathon. And I knew, unlike a regular 26.2 mile marathon, the Comrades Marathon was an ultra marathon that ran 56 miles from Pietermaritzburg to Durban. Durban is on the southeast coast of South Africa. And I knew a little bit about this, and this race, I'd listened to some podcasts about it. I had read the history of it. I knew that Comrades was the oldest ultramarathon in the world. It was started in 1921 by some guys who were veterans of World War I. And they decided that to honor their comrades who had fallen in battle, that they would run from Durban on the coast up to Pietermaritzburg, about 56 miles, with about 2,000 feet of net elevation gain, by the way. That's uphill. And they did this in 1921, and then in 1922 they decided, let's do something a little different, so they ran from Pietermaritzburg down to Durban, and that race has kind of endured ever since then, since the 1920s. So it's the oldest ultramarathon in the world, and every year it switches direction. So there is an up year, which runs from Durban to Pietermaritzburg, and then there is a down year. And this year, 2018, was a down year, ran from Pietermaritzburg to Durban. But don't let that fool you. Even though it's a down year, and if you look at the profile map, you can say, oh yeah, there's some big downhills in there. There's also an awful lot of uphills in this race. So it's 56 miles, net 2,000 feet downhill, but it's 5,000 feet of up and 7,000 feet of down. That's how you get to your net 2,000 feet of downhill. So it's quite a hilly race. And so I had decided early on that I was going to run the flats and the downs and walk all the ups. And that was kind of my plan for this race. Now, because being the oldest ultramarathon in the world, there's also a lot of tradition around Comrades. And one of those traditions is the starting line. There's 21,500 people that register for this race to run 56 miles. It's 21,500 other crazy people that decide to do this. And they sing this song called Shosholoza at the starting line. And Shosholoza is an old miners' song. If you know anything about the history of South Africa, you know that for many years they had a system of government called apartheid, where the white minority was actually in power, in control, and the black majority, the Zulu, mostly Zulu people, were oppressed. And this song, Shosholoza, was a song they used to sing when they went to work in the mines. And it's a song about overcoming. If you think about the civil rights movement in the U.S. and the song We Will Overcome, Shosholoza is much like that song for the Zulu people. It basically means, translated from Zulu, it effectively means we will run far from these mountains on that train to South Africa. What an appropriate song to sing at the starting line of a 56-mile ultramarathon. You can see the number of people that are in this race. It's pretty incredible to be in this atmosphere, and we're actually really close to the front, even though it doesn't look like it. In a second, I'll turn around and you'll be able to see how many runners are behind us. Because of apartheid, many of you know that in the 80s and 90s, the country of South Africa wasn't able to participate in international sporting events. They couldn't be in the Olympics. They couldn't play in the World Cup. There were a lot of things that South Africa was banned from doing. And so Comrades kind of became the national treasure, the national race. Isn't that incredible? And so one of the things that's really cool is, this isn't cool, but for many, many years, it was a whites only race. In fact, it was a white male only race. But in 1990, President Nelson Mandela decided he wanted to help integrate all parts of the culture of South Africa. And so he showed up at the finish line of Comrades and handed out finishers' medals to people. And that helped bring the country together, not just through this race, but through many different parts of South Africa. And so now, today, you get 21,500 people, and it's a great combination of blacks and whites in South Africa and international runners at the same time. So really cool to be on the starting line here. The race starts at 5:30 in the morning, and so you run for about an hour before you see the sun. Remember, June in South Africa is actually winter. And so this is a picture I took at about 6:30 in the morning. We've been running for about an hour. I really tried to get a good picture to come show you. But when you take a picture while you're running, it always ends up blurry. So I'm sorry about that. But the sun is just coming up, and you can kind of get a feel for the terrain. It's a beautiful race, and it's incredible. You are almost always shoulder to shoulder with runners, 21,500 runners. You can imagine it's pretty incredible to be a part of. I mentioned I went with World Vision, and I want to tell you up front, I'm not a paid advertiser or a shill for World Vision. I love now the organization and what they do. I'm very, very impressed by the presence they have in Africa, as you'll hear in a few minutes when I talk about our trip to Ethiopia. But the purpose behind this trip was to raise awareness for child sponsorship. You probably know how child sponsorship works. You pick a child from a country, you pay $39 a month. That money goes into a pool with all the other child sponsors in that area, and they use it to provide clean water, food, agriculture products. It could be school, it could be a healthcare clinic. Whatever the needs of that community are, that money is pooled together and goes to the benefit of the community. And so the goal that they gave us when we started was to run 56 miles and get 56 kids sponsored. And so that's the goal I had going into this run. And so one of the cool things about South Africa is World Vision South Africa had a huge presence on the course. Now, I've always referred to World Vision as a global aid organization, in quotes, right? But I found out that that's not true. It's not a global aid organization. It's actually a collection of national aid organizations that are each independent, but just choose to work together. And so what I heard while I was on this trip is World Vision is held together with a handshake, a hug, and the Holy Spirit. That's kind of what they say. And so there's a national U.S., World Vision U.S., and there's also a World Vision South Africa, and there's a World Vision Ethiopia, and they're all independent of one another, but they just, through this handshake agreement and by the works of the Holy Spirit, decide to work together. Now, the cool thing about this is World Vision South Africa has a presence on the Comrades course. At 35K, which is about 20 miles, give or take, they have a school along the course. And World Vision South Africa staff agreed to hold a bag for us. This is a little bit short of the halfway point of the race, that we could put anything that we wanted in the bag that we might want at about the halfway point of the race. And you could tell because the school was on the left, there was a big orange tent on the right, which had your bag in it. And so we get to this school, and all these kids are out there. It's a Sunday. They're out there yelling and screaming and handing out water and handing out Coke. And then on the other side of the road is a tent. Now, I had strategically placed the things that I would want most at this point of the race, which were Pringles, because you're going to be hungry at 35K, Twizzlers, and then the rest of my gels and things that I used to fuel that I would put in my pocket. I didn't want to carry all of them with me. And so I get to this tent at almost the halfway point, and this beautiful woman from World Vision South Africa runs up to me with my bag, and she hands it to me, and she goes, "Here you go." And I said, "Oh, thank you so much." And I open my bag, and I go to sit down in one of the chairs they had there, and she said, "No, you cannot sit, you have to run." And so it's like, but I've been running for 20, can I just have a minute? But she was insistent that I go. And so I think, well, how do you eat Pringles while you're running? You know, how do you eat Twizzlers while you're running? And so I opened my Pringles and I took like that many of them. You know how hard it is to eat like that many Pringles when you've got a whole can in front of you? And I pulled out my Twizzlers and I said, well, I'm not going to eat those. And so I took my gels, I took my stack of Pringles, and I gave the rest of the food to the kids on the side of the road, and they loved it. They had a blast. And then I took off running again. One of the cool things about World Vision South Africa, there are two kinds of field offices, or there are two kinds of offices, national offices that World Vision has. World Vision US is called a support office. Its main job is to raise support, it's to raise funds, to fund the work of World Vision, which happens in the field offices. So some countries have a field office, and they do most of the work, and some countries have a support office where they raise most of the money. South Africa is the first country in World Vision history that has transitioned now from a field office to a support office. They actually raise more money in South Africa than they spend in South Africa. And that's really cool to get to talk to the staff and hear how that has happened. So I was really impressed with that. One of the things that I mentioned before is this is the only good shot, by the way, I have of me actually running the race. I'm there in the hat in the center in the World Vision jersey. I love to run, but I'm not the fastest runner. One of the traditions that I mentioned around Comrades, there's a lot of traditions, and one of them happens at the finish line. This is a 56-mile race. It is one day, and you have exactly 12 hours from the time the race starts to finish. At 12 hours, what happens at the finish line? The finish line is in this stadium. I'll show you here in a minute. At 12 hours, what happens is there's a man with a starter's pistol, and he stands with his back to the runners who are streaming over the finish line, stands right on the finish line like this, as starter's pistol. When the clock turns 12 hours and 0 seconds, he fires the starter's pistol, not being able to see who's coming in behind him. And security guards stream across the line and grab hands, and they don't let anybody else finish the race. If you run 56 miles in 12 hours and 1 second, you are not a finisher of Comrades. And so as a result, what happens is people tend to put everything they have into the race, especially in the last few miles. And so as a result, Comrades claims to have the largest non-combat medical team anywhere on the planet. And so what happens is people really put everything into this effort. So I think it's great that Comrades has a sense of humor, and they include this in your packet pickup when you go get your number. This is a brochure on funeral planning, just in case the whole running thing doesn't work out. You know who to call, and you know how to plan your funeral. We all got a kick out of that the day before we were getting ready to run 56 miles. But despite the risk of not finishing, I did finish the race in 11 hours, 44 minutes, and 44 seconds. Plenty of time to spare. I just barely got beat by the winner, who got me by about 6 hours and 18 minutes. The winner of this race ran it in 5 hours and 28 minutes, which is about a 5:50 per mile pace for 56 miles, if you can imagine that. But 11 hours and 44 minutes. What an incredible race. And I mentioned that my goal was to walk the ups and runs, the flats and the downs. I kind of did that until Pinetown. You can see the splits at the bottom. 68.8K is about 42 miles. So through 42 miles, I kept a pretty consistent pace. And then I couldn't run. I had some calf cramps. I couldn't run the flats anymore, so I had to walk the flats. And then the last 10K, I had to walk the whole thing. But I was watching my watch. I knew how I had time to finish. My goal was just really to finish and to have a great experience. And so it was really cool. Really neat that the race finishes in Moses Mahibda Stadium, which is a stadium that was built for the World Cup. You may remember the World Cup was held in South Africa not long ago. So this stadium holds about 50,000 people. And when you get to this stadium, if you finish like I did with only 15, 16 minutes to spare, there's about 20,000 people in this stadium to watch the finish. I've never seen anything like that. I run into the side of the stadium. There's 20,000 people yelling and screaming and cheering. And in the last 15 minutes, as I got there and got to my seat, because if you're an international runner, they reserve a seat for you. I got there and got to my seat. Of course, they make you you can't just go to your seat. It's right past the finish line, the international area. But when you get to the stadium, they tell you to get there, you have to walk up to the concourse and then walk back down. So if you can imagine running from here to Lucas Oil Stadium, okay, that's about halfway. And then you get there and they say, that's great. Now just walk up to the 3 level and then turn and then walk back down, and then you can take a seat, right? That's what they do. But we're sitting in the international area, and in the last 15 minutes, it just gets louder and louder, and more people cheering, and more people coming in, and they're running in, and they have these big groups of runners called buses that have like a 11:45 sign or a 12-hour sign, and they get there, and then at 12 hours, you hear that gunfire, and the whole stadium, 20,000 people, goes silent. And you just hear this, and then you start to watch dreams break as people get stopped at the finish line. It's really tragic. It's really heartbreaking. But we had 28 runners for Team World Vision, and 25 of us finished. And so that was pretty incredible to get to see that. What do you do the day after you run 56 miles? Well, you take a break at the hotel. We had a great hotel room right along the coast at Durban. This picture, I'll just tell you, I was soaking my legs in the swimming pool because it was like 68 degrees, the pool was. And I leaned back and I went, wow, that's a nice picture. That was about how much energy I had. They call the day after Comrades in Durban, they call it Penguin Day because everybody walks around like this. They walk around the hotel like this. And so you can tell who ran Comrades. Pretty neat experience. It really was the experience of a lifetime, and I was really blessed to be able to do it. And people always ask me, well, what did you learn from running Comrades? And so here's what I learned. I'll just tell you before we go on to the rest of this trip, the really important part of the trip. What I learned was that I spend way too much of my life living vicariously through other people on social media, on my phone, sitting on my couch and watching other people's experiences. And I have to tell you, the night before Comrades, I was scared to death. I was sitting in my hotel room, literally reading scripture and crying, wondering, God, why do you have me here? Like, what do you have for me here? You could have sent anybody. And he said to me very clearly, not audibly, but I could just feel him say, Steve, I could have sent anybody. I could have sent anybody to run this race. I could have sent anybody to sponsor the kids you sponsor, but I have you here for a reason. And so I realized that every once in a while, you just got to do something that scares the crap out of you. I mean, that's the best way to live, right? And so that's what Comrades taught me. But as I mentioned, the goal of this race the goal of this trip wasn't just to go run a race, as much fun as that was. The goal was to see the incredible work that World Vision is doing in Africa. And so we spent Monday in South Africa, and on Tuesday we got on a plane, and a group of 14 of us flew to Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to spend a week watching the work that World Vision was doing. Because we'd raised money for clean water, our church had, and so we wanted to see some water projects, but we're also trying to bring awareness to child sponsorship, so we wanted to see some sponsorship projects. So the first stop we made was to this preschool in a place called Bowie, and we were greeted with singing and dancing. You can see some of our team there. We've got scarves around our necks because the women from the village made these scarves for us, and they brought them out to us. And those little baskets they're carrying have food in them. They made food for us, and they brought it out to us. And they greeted us with this huge celebration, even though we were about 3 hours late getting to this village in Bowie. And we didn't realize quite why they had what we were doing there. They didn't tell us anything about this trip. And so we kind of took a look around, and we saw that there's a preschool. And the preschool is like any other preschool where kids are learning to read. And I say learning to read because you may see that these two kids have their books upside down. Everybody starts somewhere, you know. So they're learning to read, they learn to play games together, and I have to tell you, this preschool class had about 35 kids in it, and there was one preschool teacher, this young woman in the yellow shirt, she's probably in her mid-20s, and she had complete and total control over this entire classroom. So I don't know how many of you work in Hope City Kids, but if you want instruction on how to keep a preschool classroom, I can hook you up with a woman in Bowie, Ethiopia that knows how to do it exactly. But the reason that they were singing and dancing for us had nothing to do with the preschool that was here. We didn't realize until we got outside that what had happened was in the last 6 months, they had put in a water access point at this preschool. And so they were celebrating the work that World Vision did and bringing clean water to this little preschool out kind of in the middle of nowhere in Ethiopia. And so I learned a little bit about how World Vision does water projects. The preschool was partially funded by World Vision. This water access point was completely funded by World Vision. And World Vision, if you don't know, is the largest non-governmental provider of clean water in the world. And so I've had a lot of people ask, well, why can't the government just provide clean water for everybody? But if you go to a place like Ethiopia, you see the systemic poverty and just that there's not a lot of money anywhere. There's not a lot of taxes being paid. There's not a lot of industry. There's not a lot of ways to raise money for this kind of projects. But World Vision is able to, through child sponsorship and other things, bring clean water to a village. And so when they do, though, it's not just about clean water. This was the thing that really struck me when I went, is to realize it's not just about clean water. One of the things that they do when World Vision puts in a water access point is they appoint what's called a water committee. And this is a group of people who are usually leaders in the community. This preschool teacher was principal was one of them. Some elders from the community, maybe the mayor, if the town has a mayor, will be on the water committee. And the water committee has complete control over that water access point. They get to decide when it's open, how often, and for how long. And so it's not just kept running all the time. They have a lock, and they open it up usually twice a day for the community to come in and get clean water. Now, this is important for this preschool, and the reason that they celebrated this water access point was just put in last October, which I thought was really cool because our church was raising money last October for clean water projects, and so to make that connection was really awesome. But this was put in last October, and before that, the closest source of water was 3 kilometers away, and it was a pond, and they had to walk to the pond. And so we got to talk to this woman named Tefana. I think I've got a picture of her somewhere, but I don't see it, so maybe I don't. Tefana was one of the women in the video I just showed you that was dancing with the basket on her head. And Tefana was the principal of this preschool. And Tefana told the story about how every day before this water access point came, she would have to walk 3 kilometers each way. Here's Tefana right here. This is her. A beautiful woman, about 45 years old. Tefana would have to walk 3 kilometers each way to go get clean water. And she did this twice a day. She would take 2 jerry cans with her, which these jerry cans are about 5 gallons. And they hold about 40 pounds of water each. And she would carry them 3 kilometers to the nearest pond. And she would fill them up with pond water and bring them back for her family. Now, they would boil this before they drink it. But they use this water for cooking, for cleaning, for laundry, and for everything else that their water needs are. And so she carried this. She carried the empty cans 3 kilometers and carried them back full twice a day for her family. And Tefana told us that the most difficult part of this journey wasn't actually carrying the water. It was that they had to walk over some really dusty, rocky roads and through some terrain. And this is an actual canyon that we had to cross to get to the preschool. This is about 30 feet deep at its deepest depth. And so she would have to walk across this canyon 4 times a day, twice on the way out and twice on the way back to get water. And what Tefana told us was that her feet would get dried out and cracked. And the dust would come up on her face, and her face would dry out, and her face would actually crack and bleed. And Tefana told us that thanks to clean water, thanks to World Vision, she said, I have dignity again. That I am, and she said this, I thought this was so good. She said, I am learning to live as a new creation. And if you think about that, and you think about our journey with Christ and how the Bible says that we are new creations when we're made new in Christ, but man, doesn't it take a while to learn how to live as a new creation? Did anybody in here, if you've accepted Christ, did anybody in here immediately stop sinning as soon as you accepted Christ? Nobody? No, I think that's about 0%. Doesn't it take some time to learn to live as a new creation? And there's something spiritual about clean water that is far more than I ever imagined. That I just thought, well, it's safe drinking water, and she doesn't have to worry about disease for her family anymore. And that's important. But there's something very spiritual about the bringing of clean water. And so I just thought that was really incredible to hear about that. Now, our group got to experience a water walk while we were there. We went to this pond, we filled up these cans, and we each got to carry them. And up on the hill, you can see the feet up there. There were quite a few Ethiopians that were getting their evening's entertainment, watching these white Americans try to carry this water up that muddy slope and then just over to our vehicle. It's probably 300 yards, and it was one of the hardest things we did in the 2 weeks we were there. And we ran comrades. And so just to only have to carry it to our car was pretty amazing to get to see that. And as you saw, the water that we got was not very clean out of that pond. And so it's funny because we carried it to our car and we set the cans down and they said, okay, you can get in the car now. And I thought, well, what's going to happen with all that water that we worked so hard to collect? And as we drove away, we saw them pouring it back out on the ground. And we're like, that's all our hard work. We did that. I was a little concerned when we first arrived in Ethiopia because they picked us up in these white Land Cruisers, 5 of them. And I've been to Haiti before. I talked to Jess backstage. She's been to Haiti. Have any of you been to Haiti? And you go down there and you see these Land Cruisers that the UN drives. And I know in Haiti that people don't love the UN. And so I've seen kids throw rocks at these cars. I've seen people spit at these cars as they go by, and I thought, man, we're going to be so conspicuous. How bad is this going to be? But what I realized as we rode in these white Land Cruisers is that the people of Ethiopia love World Vision. They love it. As we were driving down the roads in these mostly deserted rural roads, farm fields on both sides, we found out that if we just wave out the window to the farmers in the field, they would wave back. And if there were kids working in the field, which there often were, young boys, especially 10, 12 years old, they would drop their tools and come run to the road and wave to you. And one of our drivers, a man named Abraham, was telling us that kids will often run behind the vehicles and chase them and say, my truck, because World Vision helped build their school or put a water access point in their community or whatever it is, that they have like this ownership of World Vision. And so they love these cars, they love these trucks. And you're going down these, and they're needed. I can see why they're needed because the roads are really rough and rutted and rocky. And sometimes you'll be going 35 miles an hour down a road, and then you'll have to all of a sudden stop because there's a giant pothole. And our driver, Abraham, told us there's a lot of livestock that crosses the road. And we asked him, hey, Abraham, how many animals have you hit in your, he was driving 17 years for World Vision. How many animals have you hit in your car? And he said, no, never hit an animal. He said, but sometimes a child will run behind the car saying, my truck, and I'll have to stop for a pothole, and the child will run into the back of the truck. World Vision, saving children one at a time, right? And so we said, Abraham, how many kids have you hit? And he said, oh, I cannot count. I cannot count. The highlight of the week for me was I got to meet my sponsored child, a girl named Abebu. Abebu is 10 years old. She lives in this village called Shishogo. And we got to pick her up at her school and take her to the World Vision compound where we had lunch with her. I got to talk with her. I got to talk with her. Her father came. I got to meet her father and talk with her father. And it was really cool experience to get to meet some other members of her family. I got to talk to her father and just let him know, hey, I'm not here to replace you. I'm not her father, you are. I'm just here to partner with you, to walk alongside of you. And that was really neat. We talked about, what did we talk about? We talked about her family. We talked about school. And then we talked about a little bit about just World Vision and how she's been involved. But what I realized was that kids are the same everywhere. And she really didn't want to talk to an adult, even an adult that she, especially an adult that she just barely met. And there were some translation issues because we spoke English, and they told us to bring an Amharic phrase book. Amharic is the national language of Ethiopia, but what we realized as you get to these villages, there are 83 different people groups in Ethiopia, and they all have their own indigenous language, and none of them speak English, and none of them speak Amharic, and so we had only one translator that could translate from Hadia, which was the local language, into English, and so oftentimes we'd have to work through two translators, one that translated from Hadia to Amharic, and one that went from Amharic into English and then back, and so that kind of tiresome, and so she decided she just wanted to play. And so we played with bubbles, and we played, we colored, we drew together, and then we played the most popular sport in Ethiopia, which is, of course, not soccer. I was shocked. It's volleyball. Can you believe it? We brought some soccer balls to this school, and these kids all started following us around, and they were like locked in, laser focused on the soccer balls. They were watching everywhere we'd go. They were watching the soccer balls, and we'd stop and they'd stop. And we'd go and they'd go, and then we'd stop and they'd stop. And we knew they were watching the soccer balls. And so at the end of our meeting, we took the soccer balls out and handed them to them. And the kids ran off, and they ran across the field to a volleyball net and started playing volleyball with them. And I was like, what the heck is going on here? I thought this was Africa. They should be playing soccer, right? We got to see Abebu take her first car ride, which was pretty fun. She was very nervous at first, but then she started seeing some of her friends along the street, and she would wave at them. And by the end of the trip, she's like, hey, and she saw her mom. Her mom was walking back to the home, and she's like, hi, Mom, or whatever it was in Hadia, she said. And so then by the time we got to the place we were going, she was very excited. Unfortunately, her traveling companion didn't fare as well. We had two of our World Vision team members in the car and two of our sponsored children. And the other sponsored child had also never ridden in a car before, but she had the center rear position of the car, and she got car sick while we were there. And so our car had to get cleaned before we could get back in it. It was not great. But we got to meet these sponsored kids from everywhere, and everybody on our team of 14 had a sponsored child in this village, and they all came together, and they got to play together, and we got to play with them, and we got to experience what they get to experience. And it was a great reminder to me that kids are the same everywhere you go. They just want a chance. They just want an opportunity to have some fun in their life. They just want a chance to do something great in their life. And as I was kind of processing, I came back. Well, there's one other thing that the last thing we did while we were in Ethiopia. We finished this whole week of trips, and a pastor from the local church came over to us and said, hey, my Sunday school class has prepared something for you. We'd like you to come and experience. We'd like you to come see. And so we walk out of the World Vision compound to the church, which is right next door, and there's about 50 kids in the choir, and they've prepared this song for us. So many of these kids are sponsored kids as part of this church. And they're singing Kinga Latar Jesu, a Kinga Latar, which means praise to the King, Jesus, praise to the King. And I thought, man, on the other side of the world, hey, it's hard to get to Ethiopia. I had to drive to Chicago. We flew to Doha. We flew to Addis Ababa. And then we had to drive like 4 hours to get to Shoshone. It's 2 days to get there. It is the other side of the world. And I get there, and these kids are singing about the same Jesus that we worship here on Sunday mornings. And it was a great reminder to me that I thought about Matthew 25. I thought about this passage from Matthew 25. And so if you have your Bibles, if you're there, here's what Jesus says, Matthew 25, verse 31. He says, when the Son of Man comes in his glory and all the angels with him, he will sit on his glorious throne. Hey, won't that be an amazing day? When Jesus comes in all his glory, he will sit on his glorious throne and all the angels will be with him. It says all the nations will be gathered before him, all the nations. Did you get that? This is not an American thing, right? This is not an American God that we talk about. This is all the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate the people one from another as a shepherd separates the sheep from the goats. He will put the sheep on his right and the goats on his left. Then the king will say to those who are on his right, come, you who are blessed by my Father, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. Have you thought about that? That God has prepared an inheritance for you before the creation of the world. Before the creation of the world, you were in his mind, and he had something in mind for you, something greater than you can even imagine that God had for you. He said, take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty, and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger, and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me. Then the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you? Or thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and invite you in? Or needing clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and go to visit you? And the king will reply, truly I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. And as I was in Ethiopia and I was processing like what the Lord had done over the past week, I realized two things about this passage. The first thing is this, actually about this verse in particular. The first thing is this, that Jesus calls them his brothers and sisters. You know, so many times, and yeah, I've read this verse hundreds of times. I'm sure many of you have too. And you've probably quoted it from time to time when you think about doing something nice for people. You say, whatever you do for the least of these. And we kind of end it there, don't we? We kind of say, whatever I do for the least of these, we do for Jesus. But Jesus doesn't stop there. He says, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine. And that struck me because when we think of people as the least, we almost categorize them, don't we? We're kind of pigeonholing them. We're putting them in a box and we're saying, these people are the least, I'm going to do something for them. But when you're doing something for your brother or sister, it's a lot different, isn't it? Jesus says, whatever you did for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me, you do for Jesus. And the second thing is this, he says, whatever you did. And I was convicted because you guys probably get this too, there's a lot of opportunities for you to serve somewhere. There's a lot of opportunities for you to give your money, right? I mean, you're expected to serve somewhere in the church, and you're supposed to give to the church, and then maybe there's a chance to, provide something for somebody in your neighborhood or your community, and maybe there's an opportunity that you see on television that you want to respond to, or there's something that you see on the internet, or a friend is doing something or running a race or whatever it is, and you get a little overwhelmed and think, God, I can't do all of these things. And the cool thing about this is Jesus almost lets us off the hook for the number of things we do, while keeping us on the hook for our motivation. He says, whatever you do for the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, anything you do, it all counts, right? And so find something you're passionate about. You don't have to do everything, but find something you love and do something. I'm really passionate about child sponsorship. I mean, $39 a month buys so much in community. I can't send my sponsored child $39 and she can go buy water somewhere or go pay to go to school. There's just no way to do that. But in community, $39 a month buys so much. And if you want to know, as I said, I'm not a paid shill for World Vision. I had a goal of 56 kids. I've gotten 50 right now. So if you guys could sponsor 6, that would be awesome. But I've got some kids here today that need sponsors. I don't have any kids here today. I have some packets here today of kids that need sponsors. This is Linye. Linye is 11 years old. Actually, his birthday is today. He turns 12 today. And so if you want to talk to me about sponsoring a child, I'd love to do that after the service. Sponsorship is something that's close to my heart, and I love to run, so this trip was perfect for me. You may have heard this whole message and thought, man, that was terrible. I would hate to do that trip. That's cool, but find something you're passionate about and do it. Right? God has given each of us unique gifts and passions and talents and abilities. Go find yours and pursue it, and know that whatever you do for the least of the brothers and sisters of Jesus, you do for him. Right? There is so much power. It's powerful to do something in Jesus' name. And if we do that, and if we follow our passion, and if we do what he's called us to do, we'll one day get to hear Jesus say, "Come, you who are blessed by my Father. Take your inheritance, the kingdom prepared for you since the creation of the world. For I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you invited me in. I needed clothes and you clothed me. I was sick and you looked after me. I was in prison and you came to visit me." Let's agree to do that. Let's be a church that agrees to keep that in the top of our mind, that will seek the passion that God has given us, and will do whatever we do for the least of the brothers and sisters of Christ. Would you pray with me?